Thanks for checking out this episode of Operationally Intelligent, the podcast for people turning observability into business value. I'm Adam Kinniburgh, SquareUp's VP of Innovation, and I'm your host for today's episode. We're joined by Michael Hausenblas. Michael is formerly a product advocate at Red Hat, a cloud-native ambassador at the CNCF, and now a product manager at AWS who specializes in intelligent operations. Michael is also author of the observability newsletter, 011y.news, and Cloud Observability in Action, available from various online bookstores. The conversation dives into what operational intelligence means, how it relates to monitoring and observability, and Michael also shares his views on how to make operational intelligence possible, from ways of working to tools to organizational culture. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Hey, Adam, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It would be great to, well, for anyone listening who doesn't recognize your name, who hasn't got your book, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, what your background is.
Sure. So I've been with AWS now for a little bit more than 6 years, initially in the container space, and then moved to the open source observability service team. So that's managed Prometheus primarily. And before that, I was at Red Hat and 2 startups. And before that, I spent some 10 years in academia, applied research. So yeah, I always describe myself as kind of like a data engineer with like data engineering background with a focus on the business outcomes. And yeah, nowadays I'm a product manager.
Nice. Any big exciting products at AWS on the books at the moment?
A lot, and not very surprisingly, a lot around AI, Gen AI, machine learning. I really see that it helps really go through all this data and help make sense and find pattern and assist us doing our work faster and more efficient.
Yeah. So I think we can probably we can fairly assume that you're going to have a good answer to the sort of the first big question for the topic, and that's, I think the easy question to kick off a discussion like this is, in your view, what is the difference between, say, observability and operational intelligence? What's the difference between the old and the new? Are they old and new?
I would see it as a subset in the same way that I see monitoring as a subset of observability, right? So monitoring, I know upfront the kind of, things that I want to ask. I can alert on it if something goes above a certain threshold, but I'm not really in a position to ask ad hoc questions when something goes wrong, right? Observability tries to address that, tries to give you all the data in a very nice way to consume, query, could be a dashboard, could be an ad hoc query, to answer any kind of questions. Right? You're in a situation that there's an incident and you're trying to figure out, you have a hypothesis, it might be that. So you ask a question. And again, that question could be a simple query or whatever, to verify your hypothesis. And taking that a step further, there are a number of processes, and it starts on the left-hand side if you want, continuous integration, continuous deployment, right? All the testing, the automation there, even smoke testing and canaries and all of that. Having also a clear process after the fact, right? There's always something happening, right? Might be something internal, there might be an external customer impacted, but you also want to have a very clear process and tooling support for what happens after the fact. You want to learn, you want to always make new mistakes, not repeat the old ones. That's pretty boring, right? So in a sense, observability is a subset of this intelligent operations, because you don't need the observability, to gain these insights, these actionable insights, but there is more to it, right? How do you deal with these incidents and beyond?
So operational intelligence is bigger than, or is part of, bigger than observability?
I would say that observability is part of operational intelligence, right? It's not just that.
Yeah. Well, what else is it? What do you think sits around? So
if you think about one of the offerings that we have in AWS is CloudTrail. So you have, an idea. You could say, argue this is part of the traditional observability, but very often you don't really know, what kind of excess might be what you really want to trace, right? It might be because of some fraudulent activity. It might be because of some other reason. But it all has to do with how can you, from the inside and from the outside, assess the health of your system and get, if something goes sideways, get back to green, get back to a healthy state better, right? And faster, right? That includes SLOs, right? Which sometimes are like, oh yeah, it's just metrics. Like, no, this is like how your service is perceived from the outside, right? Rather than just looking at, CPU utilization or whatever, which tells you it could be perfectly healthy. But if your customers are unhappy,
Yeah.
that's not great. Again, part of this intelligent operations. And as I said, this is a very part of our culture here at AWS as well, dealing with these incidents. But very often they're called postmortems, having a database of postmortem documents or whatever entries that explain what went wrong, asking these 5 whys to figure out what are the underlying patterns, what can we improve. And again, as I said, making new mistakes, not repeating the old. That's kind of boring.
I think just to sort of echo some of the sentiment in there. I mean, at Squared Up where I work, we run a SaaS platform
Right.
on a mix of AWS and Azure services. And so, yes, we have lots of observability data. We have CloudWatch. We have all sorts of tools collecting data.
Correct.
But sometimes what we just want to rely on actually is the Slack channel that posts interesting notifications about customer signups or people adding their first
Right.
plugin or building dashboards. Right, the platform status for us isn't just the sum of CloudWatch logs. It's also
Right.
that user experience testing. It's, are people buying? Are people taking trials?
Correct. Correct.
It's a whole bunch of things.
And if you think about it, because as I said, I have an engineering background, but moved to product, and wearing my product hat for a moment, this data, this operational data, is actually a great source also for me in terms of, on the one hand, dogs not barking, like what would you expect, what is not there, but also to identify new opportunities, right? Like, maybe there could be a feature or a new whole product that addresses a certain demand. And that is something that maybe because it's very, very often operational only, is kind of like undervalued or under addressed, right? That you can do much more than just it's perfectly fine, but it's almost the baseline. You want to have that tooling in place and the procedures in place that you can fix something quickly, communicate to your customers, and understand what's going on. But then beyond that, you can do much more, right? You can be more efficient. You can focus on the interesting stuff rather than doing something that is boring and nobody likes to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can certainly. One of the other things that sort of stood out from what you said there was like learning's a big element, right? You're improving the
Yeah,
future by learning,
exactly.
and I know from personal experience that in the past, in the let's say the old world of monitoring, sometimes you might be 2 or 3 repetitions around the same problem happening before somebody goes, oh, actually, this happens all the time. Why don't we fix the
Correct.
root cause? And it was almost like a byproduct of repeated failure. There was no real force to learn in some organizations, but
Right.
observability and then certainly into operational
Right.
intelligence, I think, is driving that
Right.
need to be better.
And to be honest, and I gotta say, I love these ops win mail when someone sends out, we've improved the efficiency here, or we using less resources there, or whatever it is, because they're very, very measurable, right? You can clearly say, because of this fix, we now are that much faster or use that less resources and so on. And that is something that, in contrast to many other things, where it's sometimes really, really hard in the observability space to define the return on investment, right? It's not always that clear. This new situation, this new tool, this new migration to a different vendor, whatever, what is the actual return on investment, right? And these ops improvements very, very often clearly are measurable, right? You clearly have, before that, now we rolled it out, after that, and you can clearly, say what is the improvement and measure it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like a pretty admirable thing that people should be working towards, right? Everybody should be trying to get on this train. Well, what do you think are maybe some of the what are the biggest challenges organizations are facing, sort of trying to move beyond monitoring to observability to operational intelligence?
I find, based on my conversations and as a product manager, I'm, talking on a daily basis with customers, which I really love the fact that, having this kind of like seeing all different kinds of organizations across different verticals, how they work and how they, approach things. I think it's very, very often an organizational challenge rather than purely, am I using this tool or this standard? Of course, always use open standards. And if it was me, open source, but, it's really, is the organization ready for that, right? If you have, let's say, this very traditional, here is this development track, right? You have development roles, developers who are incentivized to produce new stuff, to create new features, products, whatever. And then you have operational roles. They are literally incentivized to the exact opposite, right? Any change is bad, right? Whenever you have change, this is a risk. You want to avoid that. If you have that really far apart and you're throwing stuff over the wall, then it's really, really hard to get into a mindset where you say, hey, we need to work together, right? And that's what I personally, I'm not saying, everyone should be doing that, but I personally love in Amazon and AWS is this kind of like merge model where we have our software development engineers who are part time. When they are on call, they are only on call. They don't develop anything. Otherwise, they are developing new services and offerings. And because they change these roles, they have the incentives more or less built in to really do great instrumentation, having great visibility, because they know the other week they are on call. The same, when I'm on call, essentially this kind of incident coordinator, communicator, so communication to the outside world and internally, seeing like what is the customer impact and so on. I feel the same thing, right? The better I get an idea, who is impacted, where are we, how long will it take, etc. The more fun it makes, even if it's a not so nice time of the day,
Yeah.
where you'd rather be in bed. But having this kind of like, I feel I'm on the call with people who care as much as I do. Everyone is like, all right, let's do that. Let's, make that happen. This is a culture that you can't just, buy, but you can buy a tool, but you cannot buy this culture, right? I don't know. I don't have really great tips to say like, this is the thing that you need to do, but at least be aware of like, and be honest to yourself. What is your culture? What is your, how are you set up internally to address these things?
Mm. Well, I was actually just going to ask whether you thought that was driven by sort of company process or whether it was just like a great culture with the right people. It sounds like it's the latter, which is really nice to hear. Is that, I mean, that's obviously hard to replicate. It's hard for somebody to just go, oh, I'll just get a really great bunch of people and everything will be brilliant. Is there some, is there some nice driving force behind like helping shape that right ethos in a team?
I think you can lay the foundation. You can, design. It's a little bit like a garden, right? You can create certain parts and then just grows in some direction or the other. But you decide, right? Like, do you plant the one thing next to the other or not, right? So I don't think it's just hire great people and then let everyone do what they want. You need to have, as I said, thinking from first principles, like the incentives, right? If you have this divide between development and operations, maybe there is a way, right? Maybe there are models that make that work, but I find it really hard, right? Because the incentives are different, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, there's nothing good or bad. It's just literally like, if I'm in that ops role, then I'm incentivized to make sure that not too much changes at one point in time. And the same thing for development role in the other direction. So it's really, yes, it is the culture, but it is something that you can plan, right? You can look at what are other people doing, what is, what are the processes that I can put into practice. So I don't think it's impossible to do. It's just, you can't just buy a tool and everything will work, right? Or whatever it is,
Yeah.
open source project, whatever. It's part of the solution, but you need to do much more, not just the tool itself.
Do you think that sort of nice synergy between the right people with the right tools with the right incentives is that what sort of drives operational intelligence, or is that fundamental to all just having a generally good technical culture in an organization?
I think Yes, it is really important, everything you just mentioned, but it's really part of the culture is also that you feel safe, right? Like I know my colleagues have my back, they know I have their back. And, when I mentioned earlier on the post-mortem, right? We have this huge database. It's called, in our case, it's called correction of error, but it doesn't really matter what the name is, where, you really take the time after the fact and ask yourself, why, what exactly happened? Why did it happen? Ask the five whys and figure out what to improve. And another great example for, where AI can really help, seeing these patterns. If you have hundreds or thousands of entries, you can kind of figure out, things that go across the organization. But again, it is this, if you go in there having a blameless postmortem, which is very easy said or written, but really,
Yeah.
really hard to really say like, hey, this is not about you making a mistake, right? This is about, well, the fact that you were able to make that mistake means we as an organization have failed because you were able to do that, right? And again, this is something that kind of comes with from leadership saying like, look, this is not about an individual making mistakes and pointing out, you fat fingered that or whatever. This is about consistent and constant improvement in the organization, right? And again, these processes saying like, okay, when do you write a COE or a postmortem? I just used
Yeah.
that visual name, not to confuse people. Or the fact that you do it at all, right? It's like, is it worth it, right? Is it worth our time? Absolutely it is, right? But you only see that, like it's the long game, right? You only see that after some time, right? And that's why I'm saying you can easily look at various institutions and organizations and look at their best practices and pick and see what works for you. But it is work, right? You need to identify those things.
You mentioned your colleagues having your back and you having theirs. Did you in what sort of sense is that, like, having each other's back through knowledge and access to data and tools and sharing, or
It's just, when we are on call, we have different roles, right? There's engineering looking at, what is the problem? How do we fix it? Maybe it was a dependency of our service, or it was a bad deployment or whatever. So they focus purely on what is it that went wrong and how can we get back into normal state. And I focus on the conversation with customers, essentially, saying like, okay, we experienced this error rate, we're working on it. And finding a resolution to that. And for that, we need to communicate and sometimes over communicate. And this is a stressful situation for everyone, right? Might be a colleague who is only a couple of months at AWS. It might be someone who goes through something. But at any point in time when I jump on a call, I have the feeling like, we are in here together. This is not about, blaming or whatever. This is about resolving that situation, and everyone is really interested to help out each other. And as I said, part of that is this over communicating, right? Saying like, okay, did I hear that correctly? Is it that way? I repeat what I understand. Because in this situation, you don't really want to cause even more confusion through kind of like sloppy communication or whatever. Right? That's kind of stuff.
is at AWS when you are sort of troubleshooting an issue like that. We often one of the problems we try to solve at Squared Up is sort of democratizing access to data. We want to be a single pane of glass for an organization. Many large organizations, that model doesn't work, and they have to stick with the many tools, and they often create silos and individual teams and a sense of ownership and sometimes a
Correct.
sense of territory. Does getting sort of operational intelligence right sort of require you to break down those barriers a bit, to be more open, to share things, to for everybody to be able to check things out, or is it that, like, good communication between experts?
I think you can scope it to your organization. Like in my case, that would be the service team looking after a number of services directly. It would be great. It's probably not that easy to get that kind of transparency and communication across the board. The further away something is, the harder it is. Obviously, I might not know the person over there. But at least, within your immediate team, right? Having that kind of, and that's maybe a great starting point, right? If you have a team that is healthy and that is practicing it, and it's kind of like, oh, we have these results. We have, gained these insights, we are faster, more comfortable rolling out, or whatever it is, then other teams might pick that up and go like, oh, actually, why don't we give that a try as well?
When we're thinking about all of the different systems, the different tools, the incentives for people, do you think cost is ever a factor in an organization sort of moving into this sort of world? Not just the cost of the tools, but the cost of those incentives, the time.
Right. Yes, cost is a factor, and that's where the cost of certain things is easy to determine, right? If you ask me how much does that tool cost per month or to acquire it or whatever it is, that's easy to put a label on. Not so easy how much it costs you. There are opportunity costs, right? If you are training something and then you're not productive for something else, is it worth it? Maybe not this month, but in the long run it is. So there are costs that, if you look at TCO or whatever, it's really hard or harder to really pinpoint and say, does it make sense? But again, I do believe there is enough material out there to look at other organizations, what went well for them, etc. The problem is, I think, more to identify what are the right kinds of organizations I should benchmark or I should, copy things from, because, not all of us are, the AWS or Google or Microsoft or whatever of the world. And that means if you simply take those things that you see there and apply them, that might not be the best thing, right? But if you see someone in a similar, size or similar like age in terms of like how far they are along the journey, industry or whatever it is, that may be a better point, right? A starting point, right? Doesn't mean that you can't, things like, for example, SLOs, right, from the outside, rather than just looking at internal metrics. Definitely something useful across the board. But there are processes that work really well at scale, but might be overkill for a small organization.
And I mean, thinking about some of the cost of storing data, even the cost of some of these tools. Thinking just about the observability piece, I know you talk about sort of open source quite a lot. I mean, not having to pay for the tool doesn't necessarily mean you're not having to still pay for some infrastructure or those sorts of things to run it. Does getting operational intelligence right, does it exclude some small companies because it just costs so much to store all this data you need to be intelligent? Or are there good ways for companies to get into this lightly?
Yeah, I think you need to be aware that not everything is necessarily online data, right? Online systems are expensive, right, compared to offline systems. By which I mean, if you have, in your online system a retention period of 30 days or maybe 100 days, whatever, that's great, right? That's what you immediately need to debug, to troubleshoot or whatever. But then there are many, many use cases where the cold data, right? The storage tier that might be, for example, an S3 bucket. You might only need that data for, some kind of compliancy reasons. You need to be able to prove 3 years or 7 years after the fact, or you might need it for some historical data analysis to understand what kind of, features or products you could derive from the usage patterns. But being explicit about that, saying like, all right, we have a clear policy in place for maybe even down to the telemetry signals, logs, this is the retention period, metrics, this is the retention period. Everything else goes to, or after that goes to the cold storage tier. And there you usually pay reasonable prices that, you can keep it around for a very long time. Of course, you don't have this kind of like ad hoc query capabilities, right? You cannot query it immediately and get a result within milliseconds. But most of the use cases there are not really that critical that you need this kind of response time. So it's part of that intelligence operations to be very explicit and clear what goes into the online or the hot tier, hot data store, and what goes into the offline or cold data tier.
Nice. You already mentioned sort of being able to use. We'll just move into the inevitable AI conversation for a second. You already mentioned being able to use AI with your big database of your COE database. Where else do you see sort of AI injecting itself into the world of operational intelligence, specifically around sort of data and analytics?
Right. I think, as I said, part of what I really believe is a potentially undervalued area is this kind of patterns, right? We are really, as humans, not so great to see these patterns automatically, right? If I go through tickets and have to manually note things, if I just say, hey, identify patterns, right? I need to have an understanding, but so far, whenever I used it, there was always surprising insights that I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. That's great. So the more we can use, and that's not just GenAI, right? Yes, GenAI, this is what is currently on vogue and definitely important. But I do remember back when I just moved from academia and research to startup land, there was Apache Mahout, one of the first machine learning open source libraries in Apache systems, really. And there are a number of use cases. Even back then, if I compare that, I don't even know if that's still active. It's pretty much there. You can do a lot of interesting things where any time where a human essentially is not capable of keeping everything in their head and seeing these patterns and deriving these insights. And it, I would say we are really only at the beginning, but really need to understand much better where exactly is the biggest gain, right? If it's not as simple as, yeah, let's just apply it to everything and it will
Yeah.
be it will solve world hunger and whatnot. Really identifying what are the areas where it works best. This is, I think, where we are this year and next couple of years really should be spending most of the time.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, I've been I'm working on some potentials of AI features for Squared Up's product at the moment, and one area that's really interesting to me is sort of smart monitoring, smart alerting, if you like. So
Right, right,
I know I don't want my budget to go over $100 a month. I know I don't want my
right,
CPU to be at 100%, but I don't necessarily know what's weird in some new tool or if some pattern, like
right,
you
right, right.
mentioned. I think there's maybe some really interesting things to come out of that. Again, it falls into sort of pattern analysis in a sense, I guess, of spotting anomalies, looking at trends across different data sources,
Right,
being able to sort of bring that human view of the big wall of monitors and go, hang on, that thing
right,
there
right.
and that thing there mean there's a problem I hadn't spotted. That there's
Exactly.
potentially some cool stuff in there as well, I think. Yeah. So apart from just having a complete reshuffle, getting loads of new people, all the fancy new tools, what would be your, let's say, like your biggest tip for anybody listening who is just thinking like, man, I need some of this. I need some operational intelligence in my life. What's the starting point for them? Where should they go first?
I think interestingly, the tooling actually maybe does not really matter so much, right? You have your preferences, right? There are customers who entirely focus on open source solution. Great, perfect. There is stuff. Others say, look, as long as I can outsource it, any kind of SaaS solution works for me. I don't want to operate anything myself. Great. It's really about being very intentional what you want to achieve, what are the areas that you want to invest, and then you will find the tools. I have no worries and no doubt that you will find the tool, and that is, I think, where we could, as practitioners, and that's part of what I'm trying to do with my weekly observability newsletter, to capture these end user practitioner stories where organizations share their insights, say, this worked for us, this didn't work, here, we wish we would have that tool earlier. And I think, part of the value that I see in podcasts like this one is really having people sharing their knowledge and their experiences, right? And that's what's so important to pay attention. I'm not so worried about the tools. There are always tools and there are always offerings that will be available to that.
Yeah, playing with the new toys is always fun, but yeah, I think there's more
Sure.
fundamental things. Sure.
Everyone does.
Yeah. Well, look, I really appreciate you joining us for this first episode. Hopefully, we'll have some great content to contribute into your newsletter from this as well. As a shout out for that, it's ollie.news, o1y.news. I think it's worth anybody checking it out if they haven't already. And of course, all good bookstores stock some great books on. Yeah. Thanks again, Michael. We'll leave it there for today, and we'll be back with another episode soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adam. Cheers.
Bye-bye.